Japan has been on the path to demographic oblivion for more than 5 decades. Extreme urbanization has been the norm since World War II, and there simply isn't enough space in Tokyo's omnipresent condos to easily raise families, much less families of size. The aging process is so deeply entrenched that some 30,000 Japanese die in their apartments every year without anyone noticing, until there's a smell necessitating fumigation. Japan passed the point of no return in its demographic structure back in the 1990s. But rather than crawl into a hole and die, the Japanese government and corporate world have long since branched out in ways that reflect the country's underlying demographic weaknesses and strengths. Japanese firms realize their local demographics are wretched, but they also realize that building products en masse at home requires young workers that they no longer have, and that dumping said products on other markets is often considered as somewhat rude. So the Japanese have opted for something new: de-sourcing. Japanese firms have relocated much of their industrial productive capacity to other countries, where they use more abundant local workers to produce the goods that are then sold into those same local markets. Then some of the income from those sales flows back to Japan to sustain the ever-aging Japanese population. Design and technical and very high-end manufacturing work, the sort of work done by high-skilled, older workers, is kept in Japan. But almost the entirety of the rest of the manufacturing supply chain is located on the other side of national borders. In essence, the Japanese read the writing on the wall in the 1980s. They saw how their American security guarantor resented product dumping and started a multi-decade effort to instead manufacture goods within their target markets. In particular, this concept of build where you sell has become Toyota's new corporate mantra. This new industrial model has enabled Japan to age with a degree of grace, but there are a couple of glaring problems. First, Japan's economy is stalled. In inflation-adjusted terms, the Japanese economy was smaller in 2019 than it was in 1995. Part and parcel of not being able to build and sell with and to your own population is that you need to move some goalposts. Even outsized economic success in a post-growth world just doesn't have much, growth. Second, it is exceedingly unlikely that Japan's path is replicable. After all, the Japanese experience of 1980 to 2019 is in many ways unique. Japan's transformation to a post-growth system occurred under ironclad American security cover. Tokyo never had to fear for its own physical protection at home. Contemporary America's disinterest indicates such cover will not be available for most countries. Corporate Japan faced no serious security threats abroad, in part because of the we're-all-friends-now nature of the post-Cold War environment, and in part because the Americans prevented any security threats from arising. The American departure from the world means that most countries, most trade routes, will be bereft of the sort of ironclad protection the Japanese evolved under. Japan's transformation occurred when its firms had access to global consumer markets, most notably the American market. Aging demographics aside, the American political system has turned sharply insular, and America simply is not going to be keeping the world open for trade. America certainly won't keep the world open for dumping products on the American consumer market. Japan was wildly wealthy at the beginning of its transition. In per capita terms, Japan became as wealthy as America in the late 1980s. All that industrial plant the Japanese built abroad had to be paid for, and the Japanese had to pay for it themselves. But they could pay for it themselves because while their demographics were turning, they had not turned yet. When the Japanese started desourcing in the 1990s, they still had roughly 20 years of a functional workforce to draw upon. Today, there are precious few countries who can lay claim to such a positive starting point in terms of wealth, and none have a tax base or worker capacity that will last more than a decade. Japan's population is the world's most homogeneous. with more than 98% of the population being purely, ethnically Japanese. That unity enabled social and economic transformations that would have triggered mass upheaval in more diverse populations. Japan is eminently defensible. Japan is an archipelago that has never been successfully invaded. Even the Americans were so daunted by the task of conquering the home islands that they opted to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force surrender, rather than sending the Marines into the grinder. Point being, Japan's defensive needs in a world without American overwatch are manageable, and the Japanese Navy is right-sized to the task of home defense. Finally, as with everything demographic, Japan had in spades the most critical asset: time. Economic transformation doesn't happen overnight. From the point that the old Japanese economic model broke in the 1989 stock and property market crashes, Japan had 3 decades to transition to what has become its new normal. There are precious few countries who boast the skilled labor and capital to attempt desourcing like the Japanese model. Denmark, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan come to mind. The European states on the list might be able to look after their own security with limited American help, or perhaps a partnership with the more demographically stable France. As to the Asian states, they might be able to throw themselves at none other than Japan's mercy for their security overwatch. But for all of them, it would be a crapshoot as to where they'd desource to. To a degree, the Western Europeans who formed the original core of the European Union have tried this strategy with Central Europeans whom they admitted to the Union in the 2000s. But on average, the Central Europeans are aging even faster than the Western Europeans, so this strategy will collapse under its own weight in the 2020s. The Asian Tigers have the possibility of desourcing to the Southeast Asian nations, and indeed some of that has already occurred. But none of them have the military capacity to sustain such a relationship without extensive external assistance. With the notable exception of the United States, any country with a reasonably healthy demographic is more likely to be an economic and/or security competitor, and therefore an unwise destination for their investment funds. Shifting to a new system was always going to be painful, and most countries simply were never going to make the cut. But then, suddenly, tragically, horribly, in the opening weeks of 2020, all hope fled.